unsupervised learning, computation and connectionism through modal logic with grammar as a case study. Here's the outline. I will first talk about grammar rule, and then I will use accessibility from modal logic to propose a syntactic logic. And then I'll talk about state machine, how accessibility constitutes a state and state through function, state transition, and constituting system. And then I'll talk about mental procedure to relate the formalism to the mind, the psychology, and something internal to the mind, in contrast to external, the rule that we are to conform our mind to learn. And then I'll talk about system transformation, how it is that a system improves itself, and then go back to language and point out a nativism that's demonstrated in my research. So first of all, grammar rule, composition, how starting with a sentence, then we apply a rule that transforms S into NP, noun phrase, plus verb phrase. And then it depends on which rule you apply later on. The noun phrase could have been transformed into the plus a noun or a plus a noun, depending on which rule is applied. Category, Ray, my name, it is a noun phrase, the part of speech. He, a pronoun, is also a noun phrase. So to understand, well, category in terms of transformational rule, this is one way to do that. And modal logic involves an accessibility relation. Y is accessible from X with Z. Is understood as Y is possible from X with Z, and with that accessibility relation, I propose a syntactic accessibility with the following XYZ combination. So when X is the noun phrase, so because it's possible that you apply the three rows here. The first Z that you apply that, if you apply that rule, you get that Y. So that's how Y is possible from X with Z, but with another Z, some other Y was Y could have been instantiated, the variable could have been instantiated with something else. So that's how I would explain grammar with transformational rule, and given the indeterminacy, modal logic possibility is useful here in this way. And state machine, because I've just talked about accessibility, but then how does it fit in with the big picture, especially in a system? So a state is, well, the constituent, I will, well, syntactic objects like words or even alphabets. Among them, there are accessibility relations at a certain time, and I will talk about that a little bit more later. And that constitute a state, with a state of the system at a certain time, and a function. So given input will transition a prior state into a posterior state with a certain output. And the state transition is through modifying the accessibility relation among constituent. When applying that to language, I'll illustrate that later on using something like a belief box analogy and system. So a function, state transition constitutes system. So different systems have different functions, and even if they were in the same state, given the same input, they could have transitioned differently because the system is constituted by different functions. So that's a state machine understanding in relation to accessibility. So here's some psychology, because I've only talked about the formalism. And on the other hand, with regard to grammar rule, there's some normativity about the right way to transform syntactic objects. But then mental procedure is something internal, and we hope that our procedures, the implementation of which will comply with the rule. And the modularity of mind, it's like there is a functional hierarchy constituted by system of systems. So the subsystems, modules, and the relation, input-output relation, and there could be a difference in level, how it fit forward or the other way around. These are mental procedure, and especially with the language module, syntactic objects, there is a permutativity, the arrangement, the sequence, and what there is in a sequence, in a sentence. When we produce language, we derive from given we start with S, the sentence, and then we derive a certain sentence through following certain procedure. And if those procedures, the implementation of which comply with grammar rules, then the outputted sentence would be grammatical. And on the other hand, in terms of comprehension, we parse a certain sentence and hypothesize the grammatical structure of the sentence. So these two things illustrate what the syntactic objects are that we want an accessibility relation among. So the lexicon, English, words with some semantics in English, we might not have learned all words. Not all words are in our vocabulary, although it is in the lexicon, in the English lexicon. And on the other hand, even if it is, there's a difference between a syntactic state that has a certain sentence that's being completed. So because the transformation no rules. So when S, we start with a syntactic state with only S, and then we apply the S transforming into noun phrase plus verb phrase rule, then the posterior state would be noun phrase plus verb phrase. So now there are various things that are accessible that was not before, because now we have noun phrase in the syntactic state. So it's like writing a sentence, and then there are various possibilities of how you're gonna transform that or even to complete the sentence. So that's how this fit together. And in terms of system transformation, about how a system improves itself. Well, rewrite rule, usually we talk about rewrite rule, but given it's the implementation is something internal that, and there are times at which the implementation of some procedure does not comply with the rule, given the normativity of a rule. I would think in terms of rewrite procedure, which again, given its being something internal, it could be not in compliance with the grammar rule, and learning a grammar is to conform the rewrite procedures to the grammar rule. So that's how the language module improves itself, how the system transforms into a better one, and learning would simply be an update in the function, which is constituted by the procedures. And there's a way in which the procedure modifies itself, how the old procedure get to be better such that its implementation would comply more with the grammar rule. So there is something special about learning. There is also a procedure in how the procedure gets to be modified, and that's the learning function. That procedure, modification procedure, about how procedures are modified, that constitutes how the system improves itself, that constitutes the learning function. So lastly, about the learning process, because I've talked about at the computational level, so at the connectionism level, even biological level, I'm talking about a back propagation of error, connectionist network. So the language module, when it outputs a sentence, let's say there is an expected utility, and the utility is in terms of grammaticality, how, well, whether it's grammatical or not. And there will be a feedback whether it is actually grammatical, and the actual utility, the actual grammaticality. So this difference, given that maybe it's not perfect, the learning, there's still improvement to be achieved, then there will be an error because the actual utility is lower than the expected ones, and the error will be fed back into the system to adjust the synaptic connectivity in the hope of outputting something better later on. And that learning requires the evaluation both of the output and the feedback, because we grammaticality, if we only learn through others telling you whether that's a grammatical sentence or not, it doesn't explain the phenomenon that the poverty of stimuli argument points out. So thus, we need something innate. Otherwise, the language learner would have only emitted random linguistic output. So here's a summary. I went through the grammar rule and proposed a syntactic accessibility. And having described what a state machine is, I relate that to our psychology, and especially the whole mind, how it transforms itself, how it improves itself through learning, and in the end, illustrate a connectionism that's in line with all this. Thank you very much.